I was not going to. Okay, I'm going to admit everybody.
Okay. Is everyone in?
Everybody's in.
Yeah.
Okay,
The fences
so
are all public.
yeah,
But, you know,
I didn't
here-
know that.
And yeah,
Yeah, we haven't always taken advantage of that.
no, we haven't.
Yeah.
I think it's wrong.
So everyone that's visiting or a guest, welcome and thank you for your patience. This is an exciting topic, so we had lots of things to talk about before we begin. And so at this time, I am going to turn the floor over to Miss Tanyaradzwa, and we would like for you to share with us a little bit of information about your project, how you decided on this topic, and we'll start there.
Okay. Well, hi everybody. I'm Tanyaradzwa Tawengwa. It is a joy to be here after spending 5 years studying at the University of Kentucky. This project of mine called Chimurenga ChePfungwa, a grounded curriculum for the Mazimbabwe singer, is deeply personal. It really comes from my own journey, searching for my own voice and also searching for myself. So much of Mazimbabwe's history has felt far from me or lost to me because of going through very Eurocentric colonial education. And this kind of discrepancy or this chasm and void was also evident in my vocal practice. There was so much of our own Chivanu canon, our own songs that I did not know. And so this work really began when I came to the United States as a 16-year-old in 2008 and started to, I went to an international school where everybody looked at me as the Zimbabwe person. So anytime anyone had a question about Zimbabwe, all eyes would be on me. And, at that point, I was like, oh my goodness, this is probably going to keep happening over and over again. There's so much I need to learn. And so I just began the work of going home and just starting with my own family, asking for our stories and seeking to learn. In 2012, my older brother passed away. And that too was a very kind of big moment in terms of just affirming the need to be so connected to home and to know people's stories, to know my story. And when I went home in the summer of 2012, I started to interview my family. And I started those interviews with a very simple question: what were you doing when you were my age? And when I spoke to my mother, my father, my uncles, my aunties, they all started to talk about, they said, oh, when we were your age, Zimbabwe was at war. And I started to kind of gather and learn all these stories about the Chimurenga of 1965 to 1980. And that work really was my thesis for my undergrad at Princeton, which was a choral drama called The Dawn of the Rooster. And so I just continued in that work of deepening and deepening my knowledge and also deepening my practice, because I too started to play mbira and really started to think about the traditions of my family, the father side of my family, that spiritual practice, and just deepen my walk in that way. And so much knowledge and learning has come as a result of that commitment. And so, when I was reading stories, learning, listening to songs, listening to my family tell me stories, I thought, about the power of this word called Chimurenga, which is a word that we derive from one of the great ancestors, one of the great Mondoro of the Vambire people, our people. And so I realized, I said, wow, okay, we fought many Chimurenga over the last 600 years. In recent living memories, the Chimurenga of 1965 to 1980, but it seems the Chimurenga we still have to fight is the one that is in our own minds. And so that was the birth of Chimurenga ChePfungwa, a self-liberation struggle of the mind.
Thank you.
You're
So
welcome.
at this time, we're going to give you the opportunity to pick who you would like to question you first. Each member of the committee will get about 15 minutes to have a dialogue with you. And then I'm going to wrap up after everyone is done.
Okay.
So who would you like to start with first?
I would like to start with actually Dr. McCorvey.
I knew that. That's why I was getting my question ready, because I said she's going to ask me first. Since I was the first contact.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you. First, I want to say I enjoyed your paper very much, and I enjoyed it from several levels. One of the big levels was the fact that I learned a lot, and I'm continuing to learn from you as I have from the first moment I met you. And so I would like for you to talk about, you said something that was very meaningful to me, and it was about the co-opting of the Zimbabwean canon by the colonial society, and you gave an example of vocal techniques like messa di voce, which you found to be very limiting because it did not encompass all of the different sounds that you grew up and knew were legitimately vocal.
Yes.
And so I would like for you to talk about that and in your work in terms of how you see what you are going to do to help change the narrative.
Okay. Well, to your first question, I'm going to start with a story. I was in a voice lesson in undergrad, and as you know, Doc, when I started singing, I used to bring up a lot of my chest voice, right? I didn't really know how to access my head voice. And so my teacher in undergrad was trying to kind of help me find that bridge over. And we had spent weeks trying things, and they were just not working for me. And then one day we were in, I think it was Glee Club rehearsal, which is like the Princeton choir. And something happened that made me really, really happy. And I started to ululate, I started to go, yeah. And then we went back to my voice lesson, and my teacher was like, what was that you did at Glee Club? And I said, I ululated. He said, that's in the head voice. And I was like, huh? He said, that's what we're looking for. So he had me stand in front of the mirror and ululate, and do descending glides in order to now start to understand where the head voice was. And so, I had been in the darkness trying to find this part of my voice for so long. But had someone taught me that, listen, you have a sound that you grew up with, right? That is culturally specific to you. And this is where you can begin the study of understanding, right, your head voice.
It would have saved you years.
Pardon?
It would have saved you years of frustration.
Exactly. Exactly. So that's an experience that has stayed with me in terms of like, wow, how many other singers, right, who come from other cultural traditions, who would have vocal expressive cultures that could help them, right, really understand and, vocal technique. But instead of just only, thinking of European-centered ideas and techniques as a starting point, right, what would happen if we as teachers would look and learn also from students what their cultures have in terms of vocality and build curricula, right, that would then help the singers learn to have healthy technique from that point. And so for me, that experience was literally how I learned to find my head voice.
Um,
Mhm.
that's
And then,
great.
yeah. So the second question about what it is that I'm doing to really, further this Chimurenga ChePfungwa work, I think, I talk about it in chapter 4, the importance of liberated zones, spaces that we create for ourselves that are built in the case of, Zimbabwe music from a culturally specific space and point of view from an African-centered, African-centered ideas of pedagogy, such as storytelling, such as songs, such as children's games. Children's games have so much wisdom, and to start to build programs. So last summer, I started the Zimbabwe Kids Summer Camp, which I think has been my lab for all of these ideas of a liberated curriculum. Dr. Chikoero's son has come to my camp. So if he were around, he could say whether it's working or not. But the idea is really, creating these curricula that draw from cultural material, like just rich cultural material, and having that be the foundations for knowledge. Another space I've created, actually started at University of Kentucky, was the Mshanda Pamwe Vocal Ensemble, the Mshanda Pamwe Singers, because I had so many colleagues at UK from Southern Africa. I was like, well, we might as well sing together. um, and that was really incredible to share music, because one of the things I say in my thesis is part of Chimurenga ChePfungwa is saying that we don't recognize these Berlin borders. Instead, we think of Zimbabwe and we think of the connectivity that we have, in the region. And so learning Sepedi music from Tabang or Tsonga music from Bongani, or music from Tsehofatso was so powerful. And then all of us coming together and singing, that taught me so much about myself as well, because my great grandfather Mvonyoza settled in modern day Zimbabwe, but he was actually from the same region that Bongani is from. But he fled north during the Mfetane when a lot of groups of people were fleeing Shaka Zulu. So there was so much connection and understanding that happened for me just by singing with my peers. Another space that I've created is the Zimbabwe Artists Collective. One of the things I feel very strongly is that artists are overlooked in African narratives, African so-called, development narratives. I don't really like that word development, like, oh, we are developing country. Developing to what? To whose ideas? In Pedagogy of the Oppressed, one of the lines is, the oppressed, the oppressed vision of success is typically the image of the oppressor. And so when we think about like, oh, African countries are developing, I struggle with this idea that we're trying to look like Europe. I think not. That's not what I want to develop to. So that in mind, I feel like as artists, we have the ability to create, because liberation is a creative process. It's envisioning, and you need people who have visions. And who has visions, who has more visions than the artist? And so creating the Zimbabwean Artists Collective for me was really part of my commitment to my creative community, but also realizing that we are the ones who have that third eye to see beyond what the eye can see and envision what the future looks like, so that we're simply not scrambling or trying to recreate ourselves in the image of an oppressor. And then another space is the Gwenyambira Union that I created last summer in response to an article I wrote about cultural vampires, those that subsist from the vital essence of our bloodlines. And I created that space to really make sure that our indigenous culture bearers had support in their dealings with foreign institutions. That space came about after Google did a doodle on Zimbabwean Mbira music, Zimbabwean Mbira music. And, it came to me that so many of the Mbira musicians who were involved, Anagwenya Mbira, were not fairly compensated. They were given t-shirts. And actually the major producers on the project were actually white people, white Americans, 2 white women. And so I really feel like it's important that we also protect our cultural space, but that we also have an understanding of the business of cultural production, right? The music industry is a business, and so many times our culture bearers don't have the language, you know, kind of someone to review contracts, etc. So I wanted to make sure that those supports were there. And so I have 2 Zimbabwean attorneys who have, you know, volunteered to always look over contracts, etc., for free through this Gwenyambira Union. And the hope is to, you know, lead workshops, etc., you know, just to talk about how we can really also profit from our cultural production, right? And then a third space, well, the final space that's very dear to me is a women-only space that I create that also liberates ideas of what, you know, our foundational ideas of what a woman is. One of the stories that came to me was the story of Sikarudzi, the creator of the people. Sikarudzi, which means create the people, is also the word for vagina. And so it was important for me to also create a women-only space where we could really start to reframe our ideas of what womanhood and femininity are and ground those from a cultural lens that predates kind of colonial invasion into ideas of what a woman is. So those are the ways I am working to make sure that Chimurenga ChePfungwa actually has an impact and isn't just a paper, you know, 120 pages in front of you on the desk.
Well, thank you. You know, I've always said in my life, I need 3 lives to do everything that I want to do. I think you're going to need about 16. So just eat your Wheaties and get started. That's all I have.
Thank you.
Okay, so Tanyaradzwa, from this point, I'm just going to pick people. If that's okay.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay. So I would like to go to California and have Dr. Chimurenga to talk, to begin you all's dialogue together.
All right. It was fantastic to work with you, as you know, and to be a member of this committee. This was a very thought-provoking piece of writing, and as you know, I'm personally invested in the work that you're doing. So I don't know if the time will allow me to give you all the feedback, or at least some of the most important feedback that I was able to put together from the reading. So maybe I'll pose 2 questions and allow you time to briefly respond.
Okay.
As I pass through my notes. So perhaps the first question concerns the historiography of Chimurenga, or historiographies of Chimurenga, and by extension, Chimurenga ChePfungwa. I would have loved to see a bit more on the historiographies, the literatures, the larger works, and then your departure point to immerse yourself in the genealogies. So maybe we could talk a little bit there. But then the second question, I'm giving you 2 questions at a time. How are colonists Vangezi? I think names really matter. You refer to Europeans who invaded Zimbabwe's Vangezi. And this is a name of an indigenous people in Mondoro. And so, I mean, what are they? Are they Varungu? You sometimes call them. Varungu are gods, colonist gods. They wanted to present themselves as pretend gods, well, they did create and recreate things, including the colonized in their own images, you know. Are they Maduna apparitions? Are they Vazungu, the confused ones who wandered around? Are they Vapambi, Vapambe pfungwa, vapambe pfumi, those who plunder and conscript. Yeah, so what names do you call people? What names do you call things? Are the Ndebele also part of this? Are they invaders? Are they raiders? What would Ndebele readers, Sutus, vendors, and perhaps your ancestors think about these conventions of naming?
These are profound questions, and the second one is one I'm still asking myself. But the first one, in terms of the history of Chimurenga, there is, my arrival point and kind of my major source for understanding that was S.G. Mdenge's book. And so in reading kind of, the histories of Munumtapa, understanding, Portuguese invasions of the 1400s, 1500s, and moving forward and understanding why it is a misnomer, right? For people to say, oh, there was a first Chimurenga that was, fought in the late 1800s. And then the second Chimurenga that was 1965 to 1980. No, that's wrong. Actually, there have been Chimurenga over time, right? Because these, energies of invasion have existed. And there are many ways in which, peoples who were traveling through this space, maybe through Munumtapa, were trying to bring in different ideas. Portuguese with Catholicism, same thing happened in Angola. It gets very broad at a certain point. And so I think for the purpose of this paper, I was trying to just hone in the scope specifically on why it was important to ground a curriculum culturally. But I know that in the paper I wrote, I said a discussion of Chimurenga is outside of the scope of this paper, but it was so important to address because without talking about it, we couldn't get to why, cultural memory has been why we are at this point now where we have to fight to protect and know our cultural memory so that we do not have collective amnesia. Right. So it was really part of building that argument for why this work is important. But I do agree that so much more discussion could have taken place in regards to Chimurenga. Now, in thinking about language, amagama ayadala. One of the things I think about is language of the past, language of the present, and the words that we make. So here I think of No Violet Bulawayo's book, We Need New Names. So I think, so much of this paper, Chimurenga ChePfungwa, is looking at what came before. Right? And this to me feels like part one, or the past. Then there could be a second Chimurenga ChePfungwa paper that I treat that looks at the present. Then there could be another one then that looks at the future. And so the naming I look at, like you said, Vangezi, Vazungu, Varungu, Maduna, Vapambi Pfumi, from that, Comrade Ching song, Maruza Imi. I was looking for the words, as many words as possible that I've heard that have existed to ground it, because I only ever grew up with Varungu, those who are close to God, who look like God. And so finding these words for me was very much an important part of liberating my own mind, and understanding the stories of how these names came to be. But to your point, Dr. Chikoero, some of these words, like the fact that Vangezi also refers to people who live in Mondoro, also thinking about the occupation of the Matebele in present day Bulawayo. Are they also Vangezi, right? Are they? That's an important question to ask.
Yeah.
And I think and I didn't want to go into that without giving it a full treatment. But I think one book that I read that was really, really important in understanding that was Stanley Samkange's The Origins of Rhodesia. And that's not some writing I would really, really love to do, because I think really finding the words and the truth for that narrative will help so much healing at present, because all of those feelings of like, oh, Gukura Wundi, there was this massacre, there is so-called tribalism, all of these things. I think we need to be able to articulate that Matebele story very well, as a people. And I wanted to make sure that if I was going to write it, I was going to give it the care it needs, because it is such a hot, it's really on, it would hit a nerve. But I think, yes, names are important. And
yeah, so I would say conceptually, it would be useful to think about Ujiti.
That's what I was going to say.
What is Ujiti? Maybe a good starting point would be Mafunga's book, The Mobile Workshop, the preface, where it discusses some of these things. Quick reference there will help. I'll skip a lot of things. I'll give this to you, but let me go to the next 2 points. You discuss education and miseducation. And I got to wonder each time I got to sections where you have these discussions. One of the ideas that crossed my mind was that was the question whether we are sure that Madonna were educating us or even miseducating us. I mean, who is defining what education is? Or is it us in our limited critique? When you say there was education, you wanted more education, could there have been more education, better education under a system that, as you may know from the colonial archives, which tend to confess that actually the whole point was not to educate Africans, but to re-engineer them into things. So why do we call that education or miseducation even? Right. So that's something that you might want to reflect a bit more on. But also your treatment of that question tends to be limited to the tail end of the colonial period, when actually the very foundations of colonialism had very solid blueprints on what these folks called education, which was not education. So you might want to again look at that historiography a bit more. Another question concerns the idea of illegal bandits. Again, names. Would you call colonial invaders bandits? And also, I mean, on the other hand, the colonized indentures. This gives a bit of, I think, transience to the whole idea of colonization. Was the colonizing agenda that transient? Like what perhaps I'd call the Ndebele raiders, not invaders. They didn't intend to come despoil, totally re-engineer the colonized. They didn't intend to colonize in the same sense. So, I mean, that's something that again you might want to talk a little bit about. But also one of the key issues, cultural vampires. I know one member of the panel today will talk about it a little bit. Cultural vampires. It's a very, very important concept. I was part of those conversations on social media. But this concept in your paper is hanging at the tail end of a chapter. And I was wondering why that is so. My suggestion would be that you highlight that in the introductory chapter and then give it maybe a chapter of its own or a good central section. Because where you discuss the concept, that section actually seems like a whole new introduction to the paper. So structurally, to me, it didn't quite work. So, I mean, maybe you want to talk a little bit, maybe I'll leave a second, last set of questions before I sit this space.
Yes, I was trying to, in terms of cultural vampires, right? Again, timeline. And so the reason I was really thinking on a kind of ancestral to as close as the present we can get to, right? Which is why I started with Ngano, things that have lived in cultural memory for a long time to the present. But cultural vampires, as you're saying, it's not just what happened with Google last year. It's not just you, Tracy, right? And so, yes, that could live earlier, just in the way that I was structuring the chronology. That's why it came at the end of chapter 4. But I felt like I was writing about a lot of things. And I felt, like I said in the lecture recital a little bit, that I could have written 500, 600 pages and I would not have stopped writing. So I'm still, there's so much more I feel like every section could get and I could put more into. But at some point I just told myself, just give this a pause and see how this feels. But yes, I do also feel the same desire to keep writing and fleshing out each of those sections and those ideas.
Okay, we have about 2 minutes left.
Okay, let me just throw the questions. You don't have to respond to them, maybe, unless if you really feel so. The AU Agenda 2063 sounds like NEPAD to me, the new economic partnership for African development. That development idea that's so problematic. So these agendas, they are very cyclical and the same at each point, and also very, very neoliberal. And so I was wondering how your agenda, your Chimurenga ChePfungwa 2025 agenda would jive with that. Because the 2063 is really not a revolutionary agenda at all.
It's not.
Then the language of segregation that you use at some point also left me wondering about conceptual issues. Because it makes the whole enterprise of dying to free ourselves like a desire to sit in the laps of the very same colonizers. Was it about segregation? Was it about the cannibalization? What was it? So I mean, conceptually, how do we think about the whole idea of colonialism and self-liberation? I know your mother might be here with us today. Your story at Barclays, the colonial bank that was started with monies from colonial enslavement. Again, conceptually, the story is important, but I think we'll get a lot more from deepening the analysis. Because I couldn't read those stories without thinking about my great-grandfather's cattle and other wealth that Thomas Miku plundered to build this chain of supermarkets. So when we get the door opened a little bit for us to work in those very same enterprises, what is our definition of success in those kinds of spaces? So my Mzukuru might help you to think through that one. Okay, I'll skip a lot of the things. I'll make this available, these comments available to you.
Thank you, Dr. Chikowero.
Thank you. So we'll go to a live person in the room. So Dr. Bruner, would you like to go next?
Yes, sure. You're supposed to.
Yeah,
for the microphone.
microphone, yeah.
Well, thank you for, where am I here? I'm trying to look at you.
The camera's
it is.
there.
Okay, there's a camera.
I'm here.
The
Yeah.
microphone's here, yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, thank you for this very stimulating and important work. You know that my background is rather odd and eclectic, and that includes several trips to Africa and connections with a shaman from Togo, and so I experienced possession as well, and his incredible powers of healing and diagnosis. But I think maybe since I could use the whole 2 hours easily and a lot more, but maybe just a few things that might help, I think, focus and strengthen, because as you say, you're dealing with lots of topics here. And I think it may be helpful to be more precise, at least in your own mind, when you use terms like healing, liberation, and things like that. So what is healing?
The definition of healing that I work with is actually from a book by Congolese healer and scholar called Kimbwandende Bunseki Fukiao. And he says that the healer is the energy regenerator. So generating healing, generating energy that restores a person's trust in themselves. It restores their smile and restores. Did someone just yell? Okay, restores their smile and restores their trust in the community. Yeah.
That's excellent. For me, one of the best definitions is from this book called The Science of Homeopathy, where by George Vitulkas, the great Greek homeopath, where he indicts Western Orthodox medicine as not being a science because it lacks definition of healing, of health. And I'll send this to you.
Yes, please.
But I think that this definition, we can summarize the definition of health of the whole being as follows. Health is freedom from pain in the physical body, having attained a state of well-being. Freedom from passion on the emotional level, having as a result of a dynamic state of serenity and calm, and freedom from selfness in the mental sphere, having as a result total unification with truth. So he considers, he defines the human being as having three dimensions: the physical, the emotional, and the mental. And that with the mental, the essence being the highest, and the physical being the most peripheral. And so I like this definition. I think maybe you can contemplate it as so healing would not just involve the disappearance of symptoms on a physical level, right? Because that might, with the suppression, for example, of a skin rash or something, the topical ointment may drive toxins back in the body and result in further problems because we're a whole person. Anyway, it's the connection of freedom of movement, freedom from afflicted emotions and inflicted thoughts of selfishness or self-centeredness is, I think, important to contemplate because it affects all of what you're doing, and I think it's fairly consonant with the definition that you just read, right?
Yeah, I think could I add a little bit right there?
Sure.
I think that I would add a spiritual dimension to that healing too, because thinking about what, the colonial agenda of spiritual disarmament, right? And which is why for me, creating this anthology is so important. And maybe something that I should write more in the paper is that, cultural practice and traditions, like what my grandmother did in present day Zimbabwe today, there are people in Zimbabwe who are afraid to interact with this music and these songs. And that reflex and those instincts are a part of that spiritual disarmament. I also, would add from Dr. Nyashamboti's study, Apartheid Studies, where he says, apartheid, O.R. Tambo said, if apartheid is dead, show me the body. Yeah. And Dr. Mboti argues that, apartheid no longer needs to be visible. It is invisible. It is in people's instincts. It is in our reactions to things. And so, you just talked about, Dr. Brunner, emotional kind of feelings, kind of emotional freedom from stresses. Another chapter I would love to write about my experiences is really about the stresses on the immigrant, right? Like what it means when you are trying to write and be in school, but you're worrying about paperwork, and how not having the freedom to even move physically around the world is also part of, what Chimurenga ChePfungwa needs to address. That bodies are still being confined and being restricted. African bodies are still going through this even today, just by virtue of where we are born. And so these are all things, you know, I would love to address. There's another book that I would have loved to deal more, you know, like had a more of an offer as part of an analysis to this idea of healing. It's a book called The Body Keeps Score, right? Really offering more writing on what transgenerational trauma really means, scientific studies about the levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, that are more prevalent in Black babies. And just really bringing to the fore, you know, that healing needs to address all of these things.
I think this definition, let me stop you because I'm going to run out of time there.
Yeah.
I agree, yeah, but I think this definition, Futukus's definition of the mental level includes the spiritual. And it would be interesting to have a definition of spiritual as well, with respect to mental space or cognizance. So I think it's all embracing, I think. And I don't know if you know the work of Thomas Hübel, H-U-E-L, who deals with cultural or collective trauma. It's based on Bessel van der Kolk's work, The Body, you know, and I think we're all dealing with trauma, you know, but most of us, it's little t trauma, but the kind of trauma that collective trauma you're talking about is big T trauma. It's individual as well as is collectively. Another contemplative question, how much of story is in the words? So I think this is important to think about. It's easy to think about developing a new language, new words, but how words and language can be appropriated, not only culturally appropriated, but ego appropriated. That there's an interesting article that I called to your attention from the 17th, so almost 2 weeks ago in the New York Times by John McWhorter, called How Woke Became an Insult. So he's a linguist, right? And even you quote in your response to the Google, stay woke.
Stay woke.
How in 2012, that was an indication of enlightenment. And now the way it's used, it's been appropriate. It's interesting. I'll send you that link, right? So the words, so this is kind of like story, yes, but the way that something is rendered, you know, and whether it is rendered from a place of healing, of generosity, of non-separation, as opposed to, you know, it's very easy to appropriate that for me, you know, as an egocentric tool, consciously or unconsciously, of how the ego appropriates things in ways. And so this is, I guess, the work of art, that it continually can bring us into the present and can free us from the bonds of possession or attachment in that way. So Mugabe, we could talk about Robert Mugabe comes as a liberator, as a healer in 1980, I guess, and then 87, right, as president. And it'd be interesting to think of your take on what happened to Mugabe over those 30 years as president. You know, I really don't know, except that from the outside, it looked like Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, for example, was a part of the Sandinista Liberation Front, and now he's a dictator. You know, it's like, how does that happen? That someone with genuine aspiration for liberation of the people becomes, you know, someone whose goal is just to survive, I guess, and to appropriate. So those are things to consider. One of my really powerful experiences when I was in Nigeria in 1982, I was in Benin City, which was the ivory capital of that area. And I went to a museum there, and there was only one piece of ivory. The rest was all photographs of the art that was made there, that was in Berlin, that was in London, that was in museums around the world. It was all stolen. It was all appropriated. And so I feel, you know, that I have this connection with when you write about cultural appropriation and vampires and witchcraft and zombification and so forth. Really interesting. And I can send you some of these things just for you to think about, maybe because it will help maybe deepen your understanding and help use some of these terms with more precision, which are completely consistent with what you're already doing, but to have that clarity. I mean, healing is a vague, spirituality is vague. For me, it has to do with with going beyond the ego. So it also involves mental space, but with its dimensions in the emotional and the physical realm. But that you're an incredibly positive, you're like a force of nature, and incredibly positive, I think, which I don't think you're going to lose, and you won't lose. But so you could be maybe a little more cognizant of, in your writing, of maybe even having compassion or understanding of the oppressors who are also suffering in a way that doesn't alienate, but that can embrace, not, I don't say whether forgiveness is an issue, a personal issue or a collective issue, or like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, of coming to terms with the oppression and the tragedy involved, and still being able to address that without being poisoned oneself. So anyway, I have total respect, and I look forward to seeing how this manifests and how you continue to flourish, and to help heal, and as a cultural force.
Thank you. I would like to respond to some things. I think, these are really great questions, Dr. Bruna. Thank you. I'm going to go backwards.
Tanyaradzwa, you have like 2 minutes.
No problem. I'll use them well. So, I really, one of the things that I feel, right, as an African woman, as a scholar, and really thinking about the needs of community, is we have spent many, many years, generations, centuries looking outside of ourselves and doing work on behalf of other people. And I think, I'm so grateful for the discourse of last summer and, articles on white fragility and people saying like, okay, asking for kind of, for people who have gone through experiences to also reason and write and do work on your behalf is too much to ask. About a month ago, I was in our high school Facebook group because I went to a Dominican convent. And, there was a situation where one of our former students, a white woman, had decided to take her oath into the Scottish Parliament in Chivan, in our language. And, I had thoughts about that because knowing full well how white women are raised in Zimbabwe to think of themselves today still as European first and not African, I found it very gimmicky. And I was like, we need to start having this race discourse, right? Even if it's only 3% of our population that considers themselves white. And so, in this, it really blew up and became like this huge kind of, Facebook argument kind of thing. And I realized that, as a nation, as Zimbabwe, this population, this Europe descendants of colonial settler population is very immature in their understanding of race discourse. Now, I don't know if I'm the one to teach them. That's what that experience on Facebook taught me. But I do hope that, I do have friends and allies who I hope will take on that work. But a little bit of how I focus my writing and my work is the analogy of an airplane with the oxygen masks, where it's like, put yours first and then you can help others. So I feel like as a people, as the Zimbabwe people, we are running out of oxygen. And I cannot write on behalf of others right now. I have to make sure that us and our children have enough oxygen to breathe. Now, on the idea of South Africa, I will be very honest, Dr. Bruna. I tell everybody in my circles, I think South Africa is not yet independent. I sat in on a talk with Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, where she said, we have to be careful of stories that come without the work. I would argue that South Africa as a nation has not yet done the work. Neither have we as Zimbabwe. I don't know which African country has, but I would really hesitate to look at South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation mandate as an example. I don't believe that to be true. I think South Africa is, really like the O.R. Tambo quote, if apartheid is dead, show me the body. There is no body to show. And then thinking about Mugabe, I think that, so much of our national narrative was about Mugabe in his lifetime. But I also feel like that was also a distraction, right? Because we were thinking about, okay, Mugabe, the so-called dictator, but didn't spend enough time thinking about that 90% of cultural memory that we don't have. We didn't think about tracing, we didn't learn this in school, tracing the history of how we arrived at the present. So what I also would argue is that we need to do that work first in order to fully have, have our eyes, our lenses, wiped clean so we can deal with our present as a nation. Because when I now look at, ZANU-PF, Robert Mugabe, look at the role of violence, and then I trace it back, and I look at the Rhodesian regime, and I look at their role of violence, and I trace it back, and I think of Cecil John Rhodes, all of a sudden you start to see what trauma does to people. And so, I think of, maybe this may be hard, but I try to remove my judgments of the present and extend compassion to us first and say maybe Robert Mugabe actually was simply hurting. There are stories of him being in prison, likely being castrated by the regime, so like real torture that happened to the man. And so I'm also challenging myself as someone who lived in present day Zimbabwe, at the economic crash of the 2000s, didn't have electricity, stood outside supermarkets queuing for food, and really rethinking and reframing everything. But like I said, it's a long-term work. And there are certain things that I don't have the answers to today, but I am committed to this for my lifetime of scholarship. I can assure you that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Dr. Hill, are you ready? We'll go to you next. You're muted.
Hi, I am ready. I was searching for my vitamins, forgive me. Old ladies have things to do. But definitely. But I'm gonna do something a little bit weird. Tanyaradzwa. I know this is an ethnomusicology music performance dissertation.
It's actually not ethnomusicology at all.
I'm sorry. It's music performance, right?
Mhm.
And I'm thinking about it in the framing of ethnomusicology.
Please
But
don't.
okay, I'm sorry. I know you don't like that term. I know you don't like that term. But what I also want to think about is you said some very important things that not only speak to music, but selfishly speak to a part of my discipline, which is like the intellectual legacy of creative Black women scholars, right? And so the questions that I want to ask you about your dissertation have to do with the possibilities of this research expanding that field. So they are different from the questions that I initially brought to the space, but they might overlap. You said something very specific about creating a woman's only space. And I was thinking about that when you talked about the gift of ululation.
Mhm.
So I know this happens in your culture, but it's also something that we learn a lot in dance.
Mhm.
And diasporic dance, it's a way to celebrate other women. I don't know if in your culture it's exclusive to women, but usually we use that sound to celebrate women. So whenever Sonia Sanchez speaks, we ululate, right? To celebrate her and what she is creating, conjuring, and manifesting vision in the space, right?
Mhm.
So there are two things that I want to think about. I want to think about your work as a type of, and you're not going to like this again, but a type
Cultural
of,
historian, culture bearer.
it is going to be culture bearer, but I was going to say autoethnography, but a life story
Okay.
where your personal experience is reflective of a cultural experience, right?
Mhm.
Which you have spoken to a number of times in this space, but I want us to think about it as specifically an intersectional space.
Yeah.
Because we talk about hierarchies of power related to gender, but I'm beginning to think about, right, how colonialism added a gender dynamic of objectification to the
Yes.
female body, rather than separating work by genders.
Mhm.
And I think what your dissertation is speaking to is less about the femininity and the objectification, but more about the woman's work that's happening in this space. Can you speak more about what elements of your dissertation talk about intersectionality and the Black woman's work
Mm.
in your space as a cultural worker?
We have a proverb that says Mushamkadzi. The home
What's
is a
that?
woman. The home is a woman.
Okay, I want to say one more thing, one more proverb.
Yes.
I think this comes from Asada Shakur, but I'm not sure, but I think it does. The spirit of the first mother, meaning the grandmother, comes through the body of the second, meaning the mother,
Mm.
as the daughter.
Mm.
So as the daughter is born from the mother, she carries the spirit of the grandmother.
Yes.
That is true biologically and spiritually.
It is. It is. Yeah. I in the introduction, I talk about an experience I had in the summer of 2019 at the Glimmer Glass Festival, where I was going through a very hard time. I had, worked as a young artist there, really excited to be welcomed, and then wound up being in one of the most trying experiences of my life. I felt like I was Chris in Get Out, and someone was trying to put me in the sunken place, right?
Mhm.
And it is no surprise that at that time it was 90 days, but those 90 days felt so long. My great grandmother started to come to me in my dreams. And I remember having this dream of Chadwe, and she was right there in my room in Cooperstown, New York. And she was telling me, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. You just need to learn some things. And I remember sitting with her in the dream, and she was singing, and we were sitting by a fire. And then I wound up in this dream in a forest, in a circle of other women. And we were dancing in a circle. And each time we passed, there were older women around it, they would touch the back of our neck and our heads. This is what happened in the dream.
Mhm.
And so I remember calling my mother after I had the dream. I said, Mama, I dreamt of Chadwe. When I started to tell her, this is what she looked like, this is what she said, this is this. I said, is this her? My mom said, yeah, that's her. And so I tell that story to really say, the role of my mothers, my grandmothers, my great-grandmothers, my great-great-grandmothers cannot be overstated in my work. This, everything I know, kuziva mbuya, it's another proverb, kuziva mbuya udzwa. To know your grandmother, someone must tell you. And the people who have told me the most are my mothers, is my mother. And so much of this learning has come from the mother with a capital M, whether it's my mother, my guru, my, tit, all of the women in the community have done so much of this teaching. Also with the songs, I will say, my work, I'm very excited. I love the makeup of this committee. And I love the way that my work, we have conversations, Dr. Chikoero, living fully in your field of history, whether it is, music history, musicology, etc. I am a composer. I write songs. And so I come to this work fundamentally with my work as a creative, right? Even though the work has scholarly import and scholarly heft, you know, and I have academic skills, ultimately for me, the life of this work is when it is on its feet and it's touching people's spirits through actual performance practice, which for me, I believe is the site of healing. That is the laying of hands, is when the songs are actually sung and when they actually work in the community and when people hear them and feel them. And all of that learning has come from my mother's.
Okay, so I'm glad you talked about that that experience and you transitioned it into the learning, because I'm very interested in how moving forward, maybe in a second book project, that you begin to talk about this learning as a type of epistemology and an intellectual legacy,
Yes.
right? That has cultural ramifications, but is also intersectional and is very specific to you being a daughter, right? But I'm also interested in how this intersectional approach plays out in your pedagogical pursuits, whether they be on the academic level, and also what you're doing with the children in when you teach song and performance in the camps. And you teach instrumentation. I'm interested in seeing how this Black woman's knowledge is formalized in these spaces as well. So can you talk a little bit more about that? Or is that too much right now?
I can tell you what we do so far. You know, how you know, say the Zimbabwe kids summer camp curriculum is built. And I actually thought afterwards that I should add some of the curricula we've built as an appendix to the document so people can see what that actually looks like.
Make sure that this dissertation is not public if you do that.
Pardon? Oh yeah.
Make sure that it is locked.
That's also why I didn't, because it's really, it's part of our recipe.
Right.
But
open access is like, yeah, open access is the highway to intellectual exploitation. Go ahead.
I don't know what else to after that, Dr. Hill. But agreed. And you know, so in building camp curriculum, I have a hard drive filled with all of the songs and stories I've collected over the 11 years, many hard drives, not just one. And, you know, I draw from that. I also, you know, have other artists, other culture bearers I collaborate with to think about what it is that needs to happen. I also channel a lot of what needs to be taught. But in actual form, you know, even in the virtual format, with the children are learning to sing through call and response. They learn by hearing me sing and by copying what I sing. You know, they learn by getting up on their feet and dancing as we sing. They learn through the embodiment. It's an embodied process, not an intellectualized process.
Okay. The last thing I'll leave with you, and I'll send it to you later, is that the urban bush women, they have a formalized embodiment camp called a Summer Leadership Institute. And it might be a way for you to begin to think about formalizing these processes into an epistemology that translates from the practical use into the academic use. It can generate more, you're already doing the work, the cultural work, right? But something that happens in the Western knowledge system is that when culture work is no longer observed, it's not easily translated as work, right? So a part of our additional work is figuring out how to do that. And you want to make sure that this work is documented. I mean, how many songs have you sung, Everett, that didn't count as work?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I just said to Angelique in our committee, I said, that's what happened with spirituals. And that was the whole reason for formulating the American Spiritual Ensemble, that exact reason. Because we got to keep it alive. And the only way we're going to keep it alive is make sure that we continue to perform it.
Exactly.
And then we tell the story and the history, you know, but first comes the performance.
Right. Right.
So I'm sorry that didn't relate much to the dissertation. I got so
But it relates to my practice, Dr. Hill. It's the meat. I love the urban bushwoman. I've worked with Marjani Fort Sanders, who was in the,
funny. I love
I worked with Marjani. I've worked with Maria Bauman.
Mhm.
You know, I wrote papers about them in undergrad. I love, absolutely love the urban bushwoman.
In the
And
next book, I have like 2 poems coming out to them.
oh my God, I love them. So I think also having a community of women from the African diaspora who are doing this work and really, you know, understanding how we can share work, but also protect work, that not everything needs to be shared. You know, I
The
struggled.
ways that we intellectualize the creative process, right?
Yeah, because there's something that is lost when things can be put into words as well. So I think your point, Dr. Brunner, when you said words and the ego, I agree. When words cannot, you know, there's an idea, and this is also kind of what happened, you know, with colonial claiming of ideas and spaces and namings. This idea that because, you know, these Europeans arrived and spoke things into existence, like I cannot stand the term Victoria Falls, you know, oh, David Livingstone discovered Victoria Falls. I wish I could just erase that from every book we ever, you know, every story we ever told at school. But, you know, there was this claiming and this naming that said, oh, because now we've said it, now it's real. So I want to make sure in my scholarship as well, that I'm also operating from a liberated space in which I'm now knowing full well that most of the, you know, my education has been through, you know, European created institutions, but really understanding that the indigenous school in some ways is invisible, but is the most vital school that I've gone to. You know, it's the one that has given me the actual meaning of these words and giving me these words in the first place. But, you know, just understanding that that's what a lot of culture workers like myself do, right? Is that you learn what you learn, but then you have to learn to be fluent in so many ways in order to communicate the, you know, importance of your work and also advocate for its respect. So in some ways, like my great grandmother Lina, who was she spoke 11 languages, and she used to translate my great-great-grandfather's sermons, John Wafamelusi, because he was an evangelist. And my mother would say, but Lina was actually the one evangelizing because my great-great-grandfather only spoke in English. You know. So I find that, you know, having fluency and the ability to communicate ideas is wonderful for community building. And really, you know, again, being able to speak about this cultural space in many, many ways. However, I firmly believe, though, I hope that there'll come a point in my life where the words can leave and it can really be embodied and be about, you know, yeah, it can just live and be without constantly needing to be explained. Yeah.
I think it always need to be translated because the system of formalized knowledge is so divorced from multiple perspectives. So the translation will always be present, but yeah, maybe we'll get a lot better at it.
Yeah.
Great, thank you, Dr. Hill. So we're almost done. We're about at we have a little bit under 25 minutes to go. So I'm going to have Dr. Vasona ask her questions. If we could keep them to like maybe about 10 minutes, and then it'll give me about 10 minutes to wrap up.
Okay.
And then 5 minutes for discussion. Put this closer to you.
Oh, thank you. Tanyaradzwa, I'm not really supposed to ask you questions. I think I'm supposed to be just an observer. But I have a couple of different things. First of all, I just wanted to say, as you know, I was a child in Malawi. And so I'd like to say Zikomo Kwabiri. But I know that you would say that's gimmicky. So I'll just say thank you. Thank you very much. And I really have enjoyed being a culture worker since I heard the term from a South African about 25, 30 years ago. I'm not so excited about being a cultural vampire.
No, don't be.
Right. No, I should be wary, but I am also
Nobody
saying
wants to be
to you
that.
that you are a strong person.
Pardon?
And you are as strong a person,
Mhm.
and you have the ability to, unlike many people, I think, to navigate really difficult waters. I had never heard of Tracy, so I looked him up on Google, of course, and I found that the music that he recorded is available open access. And as you know, intellectually appropriated, as Dr. Hill points out. And so you could actually listen to some of that music. I don't know if you have. And I know that, okay, so, and you, of course, you don't necessarily acknowledge that in what you're sharing with us.
I don't, because we have to define what open access means and access to who. So if open access means you have to have an internet connection and a computer, right? How is a child from Zarabani, where this music was recorded, going to have access to it? You know, so I really, yeah.
And it's also,
I know I'm very critical, you know, and it's like, yeah, give these people a chance, give them a da 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 da. But you know, we need to be.
I'm not saying you should give Tracy a chance. I'm just saying that the information that he took from elders, people who are now dead, people who are now ancestors, that perhaps has value to you, and that you can perhaps access that, even though the process of accessing that will be a painful one, because you will remember all of the people who suffered in that encounter. But you can still perhaps let those people speak to you. I don't know. This is not a prescription at all. It's just a suggestion that you need to take as you see fit and as is available to you, and as you feel able to confront, because it's not an easy situation at all. That's why I'm saying that maybe you can do that work when other people can't, because it will be too painful.
I mean, writing this dissertation was painful.
I imagine. I really imagine.
I gained 15 pounds.
Oh.
I'm serious. You know, it was hard. It was very, very hard. Specifically reading the Atkins, specifically going through colonial blueprints. This work is hard, you know, and yes, you know, there is strength. My totem is elephant. And so, you know, I really do come with the strength of a great animal. But you know, sometimes it's like, no. The International Library of African Music, ILAM, you know, is fraught. There's so many layers and so many things to discuss, so many things to really, you know, unpack in terms of their recent so-called repatriation efforts, taking 2 CDs to the Mbina Center. No, seriously, in Harare, and saying, oh, here you go, here is your cultural memory back. You know, and so again, this is something I could write about, write a piece about, but you know, I have to pace myself. Because, and
it's not your work. It's not your work.
Well, no, it is my work, but it's more pacing, because there's a lot of foolishness out there, you know, and a lot of foolishness that people see as saviorism, as do-goodism, and they want hands clapped and a pat on the back, and they want a good job for doing it. But I'm not going to be the one who's going to give it, because it's not good enough. It's not, and I doubt it will ever be, but it's okay. They can keep trying.
And another sort of personal insight, Chimurenga is important in Chewa culture. And I have heard references to the songs that girls sing. And that Chimurenga has died out in much of Malawi, but I believe it's still viable in Zambia and perhaps in Zimbabwe.
It is.
And have you heard those songs? Have you ever recorded
them? I have. Actually, I struggled. I hesitated as to whether to put that with the feminine divine space even in the dissertation, because just like sororities here like deltas and AKAs have certain things that you cannot say.
Right,
There's
all
certain
secret.
things that
Yeah.
we have in our own sororities and feminine spaces that cannot be said. So what I wrote is all I can say.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Mhm.
I was thinking about Dr. Hill's questions and thinking that was actually would be something really interesting to her. But you have this issue of what to use, again, intellectual appropriation.
Mhm. Well, also, there's a book I love. I really would love to share with everyone. It's called Of Water and the Spirit by Malidoma Some. And it talks about his rite of passage. But he says over and over that in spiritual spaces, secrets give things spiritual power. And so there are certain things that just simply cannot be explained or talked about, because once you do, you sort of rob them of their power, right? And so there are certain things in these women-only spaces, rites of passage, etc., that cannot be spoken about and can only be experienced by those who are meant to be in that space. So, for me, my work is really putting out the energy, like a cell phone reception, something, right? Where it's like, boop, boop, this is the frequency, and hoping that the people who are searching and seeking will understand what's actually going on, and that the people who need to be in the spaces will come and have access to kind of the deeper understanding and spiritual practices and the songs and the music. But unfortunately, I cannot, share everything with everybody. Mm-hmm.
But I think that people like Dr. Hill, for example, we love to know that the equivalent of, Chimwale and Chewa, that exists. Because the whole, so many of us have heard the message that African initiations are just for boys, or that, that women don't have that kind of background camaraderie that's formed at an early age, that wisdom is passed from older women to younger women in Southern Africa, not just in West Africa. So it's a hard line. You're not writing for the outside world necessarily. You're writing for Zimbabwe. But there are so many people out here who are curious. So that's sort of the tension. I'd like to thank you for writing what you did, and to say I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you for being here, Dr. Fasona. I appreciate you taking the time at such short notice to be here and, just being the outside examiner. Thank you so much.
And thank you for letting me talk. As I said, I'm not supposed to.
Oh, well, Tanyaradzwa, we're going to close with me. And, all of this is new information for me. And we were talking earlier that as an African-American, we have lost a lot of our connection to Africa and its traditions and history and those wonderful proverbs that you throw at me all the time. I'm just always like, wow, this is just amazing. Mm-hmm. So when you were doing your lecture recital, one of the things that was really striking to me was the way that you used your voice, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, and how you incorporated your European studies with the style of the Zimbabwean songs and the way that you used your voice. And I feel like in this paper, these experiences that you've had kind of merging these two, the technique with the style, needs to be fleshed out in this paper a little bit more. And so I'm going to give you an opportunity to talk about, you kind of started with Dr. McCorvey, but I want you to go even more in depth about how you are able to meld those two traditions into one that's authentically African.
Wow, yeah, this is a broad question. Mm-hmm. I wrote a paper in undergrad for Dr. Eddie Glaude, one of my favorite people, in his class called Black Power and its Theology of Liberation. And I was doing a treatment of Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. and specifically focusing on the chapter in that book that talks about national culture. And one of the things that I thought about, was, the Mazimbabwe women who have gone before me and paved ground in their creativity, like Danai Gurira, who many people know now, given her work on the stage as a playwright or on the big screen as Okoye in Black Panther. And so when I worked with Danai, she was a fellow at Princeton when I was a student, and I spent much time with her. We had conversations about what is an authentic African? Who is an authentic African? And, what does that mean? So I grew up in Harare, in part of the town that used to be whites only, during the colonial regime, but it also used to be something else before, colonial occupation. I went to school at a school that really forbade us from speaking indigenous languages, and we would be punished if we were heard speaking our indigenous languages. And so in many ways, there are things, that are European, people would say, but that are very much part of the fabric of my life, like having tea at 4 and eating scones. I grew up with that. I didn't find it from somewhere else. I grew up with it in Zimbabwe. And so I wrote this paper that expanded on Fanon's chapter, really talking about how people like me are the unintended consequences of colonialism. Meaning that we no longer see things as separate, but whether, I like it or not, whether the kind of machinations, the maker of colonialism likes it or not, right? So there are people like me who just move through these spaces easily. I started playing classical piano when I was 8. It's a part of me. I don't see it as belonging to Europe. I see it as music that I learned in Zimbabwe. So it's really, that's kind of part of the complexity that I kind of grapple with when thinking about identity and African identity in 2021. And so when it came to my voice now, I feel like a lot of my vocal struggle, my personal luta vocale was not on the breath, rather it was trying to understand which voice do I use? Do I use the voice that I had with my voice teacher who was teaching me, where I'm singing Gretchen am Spinnrade in Harare? Or do I use the voice I use when we're singing Mufudzindia Jehovah at church on Sundays? Or do I use, the voice that I hear when I'm hearing Wondo Yeminda on the radio? Which voice do I use? And I think that journey is what, really coming to my own whole, right? Instead of me fragmenting myself, really accepting the wholeness of me and the many parts of me that are me because of this very interesting ancestral genealogy and timeline that also includes, right, this colonial encounter that sought to rewire things. And then now there are all these things and influences that make me me, but they are me, And so that is when I, shared the music for my lecture recital. I feel like that was me finally arriving at the voice that I found to be mine. And that voice expresses everything that is me, and it expresses what it means to be an authentic African in 2021. Yeah.
I'm so delighted to hear you say that. And I'll tell you why, because I'm delighted I hope, now you have to, we'll know if I'm wrong down the road when you write about it. But I think that we gave you the space here to be able to find your different voices, and that we celebrated that instead of thought of it as a problem.
Yes.
And so to hear you say that makes me very happy about the program that we have here, because that's exactly what we want to be able to do is help people to find their own voice
Yes.
instead of imposing a voice on them. And
Yes.
I'm hopeful that we can get more international people who can help us to learn about their cultures and for us to help them to find their voice in the present day world.
Mhm.
You know, other thing, besides the singing voice, your perspective, you also have a composer voice.
Yes.
And I don't think it's emphasized enough that you arrange these pieces.
I
You
did,
know,
yes.
so basically, you are the H.T. Burley
That's
of
exactly
Zimbabwe. I
right.
mean, so you know, so you have that aspect of your voice as well. And we had all of this information before, but then we get to chapter 5, and I feel like you ran out of steam. And so if you could expound, if you can expound on your voice as a performer and as a singer, but also your voice as a
I'm
if you
waiting for them to
don't
call me
mind,
back.
of those who are some of our guests, if you could please mute yourself. Thank you. So if you could expound on your voice as a creator and as a composer as well, I think that those are really important and valid perspectives that need to be included in this work. So I'm going to say that as we are running out of time, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond for 2 minutes, and then we'll conclude.
Well, first, I would really like to say thank you. You know, Dr. McCorvey, when I came to University of Kentucky in 2016 and we had our first voice lesson, and you said, yes, everyone has their own voice ID, and we're going to spend our time here finding yours. Oh, I'm gonna cry. And I think, you know, there are a lot of people in the room who maybe aren't vocalists, but I cannot explain, you know, what it feels like to be a singer and to be singing, but to feel like you haven't found your voice yet. So every time you get up, you know you're doing something, but you don't feel confident yet. You don't feel powerful yet. You try, you know, you do what you have, but you're still seeking and you can feel it. But what that then means is every time you get up, you have fear present. You are dealing with a lot of inner talk in your head that you have to silence. And then every time a performance is over, you're relieved. And you're not really present in the moment, you know, of sharing your gift with the audience there because you're so scared or you're just not fully there. But, you know, I just had a performance with Boston Lyric Opera last weekend, and I was staying at my best friend Misola's house, and her husband asked me, he said, "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" And I said, "No." Because ever since I found this voice of mine, I have had no fear present ever in any of my performances. It's gone. And that's also something Nina Simone said. She said, freedom, right? There's a total freedom from fear. There's no fear in my space. And now when I open my mouth to sing, there's no more fear. But I remember singing at the Altec competition and my knees were shaking. Even though I placed second and I won and I, you know, I remember being on that stage and being like, why are my knees shaking? And so, you know, I'm very, very grateful to you. I'm very grateful to you, Dr. Clay, for giving me the space, you know, to really enjoy singing, whatever it is, whether we're singing the Countess or I'm moving through this rep. I just love singing again because I'm having fun.
You just described healing in the way that I talked about it as
Exactly.
freedom, right? Freedom from fear.
Exactly.
Well, this is a wonderful way to end, I think. So I'm not sure how to do this because we have guests.
I might put you in a breakout room.
Oh, that would
Yeah,
be
could
great.
you do
Could
that?
you put us in a breakout room?
Yes, and then I can chit chat with everyone in the room.
Good.
Okay.
Great.
And then when we're ready to leave, we can just leave, right? On our own
Yes.
accord. Okay.
Yes, or you can text me.
Okay,
So
I
just
think
give
we
me-
can get out of it once we can exit.
Yes, you can go to the main room. Dr. McCorvey, what does your Zoom say? Where can I find you? Oh,
Oh.
because you're all in the same room.
We're all in
So
the same
it's
room.
only 3 of you. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
yeah.
just one for us, and
Yeah, just-
then for Dr. Hill and Dr.
Okay, got it.
Okay, there we go. Now you have to
Okay.
join.
So we all have to